and to raise up people to do the same. People must be trained, equipped, and sent out by mature leaders. This is why we believe in the motto, by the church, for the church. We are here to perpetuate the spreading of the gospel and to teach sound doctrine. The Word of God is the foundation on which we stand. The world needs leaders who are not afraid to stand up for the truth and righteousness. Will you be one?
All right, everybody, let's go shopping. Oh. All right, welcome to class. So glad to have all of you along. This is our Christian counseling program here at Spirit Life Bible College and Seminary. Welcome, everybody, in our Zoom class. And for those of you joining us via YouTube and Facebook, glad to have you in. Also, if you are joining us in Facebook, please take a moment and like this broadcast and share it on your page so other people can see it. We have people that now are sending us in applications for the Bible College because they've picked up on these things. Google searches, taking them into the classes. So this is an exciting time, a great time to be trained. All right. So tonight we are going to be taking a look at our second lesson on developmental issues, and we are going to be focusing on adolescence. Now, there's going to be some interesting things that are going to be shared in this tonight, and I'm kind of hoping that we can get through the major things of it tonight. As usual, we don't have enough time to cover every detail that's in your textbook, so I want to especially encourage you, if you're taking this for credit, that you make sure that you at least read it through. Read it through before you do anything, and then come back through, highlight, and take notes the second time around. And then as I work my way through some of the highlights, it'll begin to stick with you. So again, this is the second lesson, developmental issues in adolescence. And we will always begin our class by prayer. So let's do that. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this opportunity, Lord, to study the human soul and the behaviors of humans so that we can help them in their conforming and being transformed. We pray that, Lord, that you would use your word and use your spirit through this program to raise up counselors, raise up coaches. I pray that, Lord, that people's lives would be forever touched, positively touched, because of what we have learned through this course here at Spirit Life. So bless our time tonight, Lord, as we focus in on the adolescent period of life. Give us understanding and give us insight in that, we pray, because it can only come from you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so I'm going to try to focus more tonight on the cause of adolescent problems and then some of the effects of it. But in order to get there, there are a few things that I want to cover with you in what I would call the introductory phase of this particular chapter. Now, everyone that's here, we all have one thing, big thing in common. We all went through the adolescent period. But we all had different experiences. And that's one thing that's emphasized in this chapter especially, is it depends a lot upon culture, upon the region that you're in, the environment that you're in, your peers. Where you live in the country or in the world makes a big difference on what you go through and what you experience in this puberty. When you begin in puberty, working your way through adolescence, a lot of things are different. Culture has a lot to do with it. Culture has a lot to do with the view that we have as we go through each and every one of these things. So in the beginning of this chapter, he mentions a psychiatrist named Armin Nikolai, and he said that this is the most confusing, challenging, frustrating, and fascinating phase of human development. Now, I want to address this. This is his view, okay? So when you look at it again, he said the most confusing, challenging, frustrating, and fascinating phase of human development. Let's not lose sight of both ends of the spectrum of that. While there is a lot of confusion in teenagers, and especially the ones that are just young teens, 13, 14 years old. There may be confusion in there. It comes a lot with identity and even sexual identity. That's not something new. We're dealing with this issue. The way it's being handled is different, but that is something that is very common throughout the ages. That, identity about, am I really a boy? Am I really a girl? There's a lot of confusion in that. And, you may wonder, well, how is that even possible? Well, it's very simple. Sin. Sin in the world has distorted human views of things. And so the devil is the one that distorts people's perspectives. And that's happened throughout the centuries. Okay, so it's not something that's new now. The difference now is people begin to normalize it, which is abnormal. Okay, to normalize an abnormal behavior is abnormal in itself. And so that's some of the stuff that's going. But so you have the confusion, and then there are the challenges. There are a lot of different things that you experience physically. But at the same time, it can be fascinating. It can be an exciting time in a teen's life. And so we have to realize that not every teenager has a very bad adolescent period, but there are good experiences that everyone can have. And that can come through Jesus. Now, one other thing that I'm going to quote from the book is that each of us was shaped. I didn't make a slide, Hazel. Each of us was shaped as well by events in the world when we were adolescents. So think back when you were a teenager. Some of you don't have to do a lot of thinking. It doesn't go back very far. But when you were a teenager, what was going on in the world? So think about it just for a moment. Lee, can you remember what was going on in the world? You and I were teenagers at the same time.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things that was going on that was affecting us here in the United States was the Vietnam conflict.
Yeah.
And so we were experiencing a lot of our neighbors, our family members that were older than us being drafted and going into Vietnam. I had one relative that got injured in an attack. He was in a personnel carrier, and he survived. But I remember the trauma in the family, like he got injured and all of that, and you wonder, is he going to come out alive? And then there were those that didn't make it. But it's more than just the Vietnam conflict. There was a lot of controversy surrounding that. It was not a pleasant time. There were a lot of protests. There were a lot of physical violence, a lot of acts of violence surrounding that. So that's what we were raised up around when we were teenagers. And we were facing the possibility at early teen years of being drafted. Then they did away with the draft, of course, and then I ended up volunteering. But it was a little bit different, but still, our mindset was being shaped by conflict in the world and the threat of the Soviet Union firing off missiles from Cuba, all of that stuff. So that was affecting the way that we were growing. You go back further, World War II, there were people that were growing up, they were teenagers during that as well. But not very far back, you guys were teenagers. So what were some of the major events in the world that were going on when you were going through your teen years?
2008, I would say the major world crisis with the finances. It was a harsh time, especially for my dad. He was an entrepreneur, so we face a lot of challenges financially.
And that's interesting, 2008, because I know exactly what you're talking about. That's when they went nuts with the housing market and people were overpaying for everything. Then all of a sudden the bottom fell out. And the economy really went to pieces. So you're raised in that as like, what are we going to go through, right? You didn't go through teenage years, right?
I'm still there.
Oh, you haven't gotten through yet. Well, then you've been through a few interesting elections then, right?
Yeah.
All right.
You relive it when you have teenagers, right?
But a lot of the experiences that you have when you're raising teenagers are nothing like the ones you had.
Right.
And this is what we're looking at here. There are different sets of circumstances. And I know that, and I believe this, there's nothing new under the sun. Solomon is the one that said that in Ecclesiastes. Yet, while there is nothing new under the sun, the way that it is packaged and its delivery is different. And the availability of things now, in your teenage years in the 2000s, you were born into the digital age. And you probably were those that were running around at 3 years old with a cell phone showing your parents how to use them. That happened a lot. Yeah. I remember seeing little kids going around in there on the phones, and grandma got something wrong with the phone, and some 5 or 6 year old says, "I'll fix it, grandma." So they're digital natives. That's what they're growing up in. So access to things digitally just comes natural to them. And at the same time, you're dealing with a lot of the immoral things that also are accessible, and it's beyond our reach to be able to help them immediately. So it's a tough thing. So while they have the same temptations, it's coming in different packages, and it's coming earlier. So teenagers today live in a teenage culture that is radically different from the teen cultures during World War II, during the 60s. That's my time, the end of the 60s into the 70s, or in other decades when the internet, cell phones, video games were non-existent. All right. Now, the word adolescence means a period of growth to maturity. That's the definition of it. Period of growth to maturity. And in a few minutes, we'll look at that section, the Bible and adolescence, and you will find that the Bible never talks about adolescence. It is more of a modern phrase that we are using to apply to a particular age group. And, Karen texted me earlier today and asked me a question about that, and we'll hit that in a few minutes as well. So, the word adolescence means a period of growth to maturity. So, when does it begin and when does it end? You cannot put an age number on it. All right. While some people begin puberty at 11 years old, there are others that don't begin until 13 or 14 years old. And that's just about the time that they're going into high school. Now that makes it awkward. I could really get into the nuts and the bolts of that, because you have some people, some kids that have begun puberty at 12 years old, 13 years old. I can remember when I was in high school, my freshman year, I was 13 years old going in because of my birthday late in the year. I was always younger than everybody in my class until September. Finally, I would catch up with them. But 13 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and I weighed 95 pounds with rocks in my pocket. And I was miniature compared to a lot of the kids that were in the school. There were sophomores that were having full beards. I mean, that was like, wow. I had to shave when I went in the Army because it was a rule. I didn't need to really shave very much because I could have gone a month and I would have been okay. But I had to shave. I had to shave. Then at some point, I don't remember exactly when, all of a sudden it came in full. So I would consider myself in the class of late bloomers when it came to the puberty and the development through the adolescent stages. Now, with that in mind, I want you to understand that just because a person hits 18 doesn't mean that they're mature. A lot of people think it's, well, as soon as I'm 18, then I'm a man, I can make my own choices. You may be a man in age per se, but mature-wise, you may not be. Okay? And physically, you may not be fully developed to the point yet. You may still have some development that's got to go on. I mean, I weighed 120 pounds when I was in the Army. 120 pounds. When I first went in, they were just handing us uniforms and stuff, and I put it on, and I thought I was going to go swimming inside my stuff. I'm like, how am I going to fit into all of this? But I began to develop. I began to put a little bit of weight on. Even when I was 30 years old, I only weighed 130 pounds. But that has nothing to do with this here. So we'll move on a little bit. So my body slowly grew, right? So you can't go by a number. Now, at 18 years old, people can vote. But that doesn't mean that they have the mental capacity to vote effectively. It used to be that at 18 years old, in most states in this country, when I was a teenager, that it meant you could buy alcoholic beverages. But not everybody that was 18 years old should have been in the package store buying beer or other stuff. Why? Because they were not physically ready to handle it or mentally ready to handle it. So it depends on where you're at and the culture that's around you, but also how well you develop through this adolescent period. So there are certain things that can affect your adolescent years that can stunt your maturity. They can actually affect you physically. So we're going to look at some of those here in just a little while. So what do we consider an adult? It's when you're able to manage your own life and do it well. That's when you're an adult. One of the things that we as parents are called to do is that while our children are preteens and then into the adolescent levels, we're supposed to teach them right and wrong. We're supposed to teach them how to make godly decisions so that as they get older and they start to mature, they can take on responsibilities for their life to the point where they know how to choose right from wrong. They know how to make good decisions, and they know how to process things a little bit better. It also requires the completion of the cerebral cortex. Okay, that has to mature. That has to connect and get wired up with the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. But at the same time, we can teach people how to reason through things. And so that is a part of maturity. So when do you really become an adult? When you can really reason right from wrong, and you can make the right decisions for your life without screwing it up. Okay? Makes sense to everybody? So there are a lot of other things that are involved in the adolescent stage. There's an awakening, a sexual awakening that takes place. There's emotions that they begin to have that they didn't know they had before, or maybe now they got weird on them. So now I want you to, I'm going to read this to you because I find this very important. It has been estimated that between 10% and 20% of adolescents experience serious turmoil during the teenage years. Okay, you got that? Between 10 and 20% of adolescents experience turmoil during the teenage years. But this figure is about the same as that of children and adults. Now, the reason that I've highlighted that and I've brought that out is because there's this notion that the hardest period of growth is the adolescent period, and that's not true. It's just as difficult for children as it is for adolescents, and just as difficult for adults as it is adolescents. Same percentages in the surveys. The turmoil, the serious turmoils. It's basically the same. What does that suggest? That adolescence is not a particularly stressful period of life, and that the vast majority are free of trouble and special stress during the teenage years. So here's the good news, folks. Not all teenagers are having a bad life. Unfortunately, if you deal with 2 or 3 teenagers that are having a bad life, it feels like 30 of them. I get chuckles out of parents. So there's hope. That's the way I see it. There's hope. So it's not as bad as people want us to think it is, but it could be better. Okay, now, adolescence can be divided into 3 overlapping periods. The first one is pre-adolescence. And you've probably heard it called pubescence or early adolescence, but it's pre-adolescence, and that begins around age 10 or 11, and it continues for at least a couple of years. Okay, so once again, that's pre-adolescence. That's when your body has a little bit of a growth spurt, and things begin to change, and your body is getting ready to move into that next phase of puberty. So it's on the edge right there. And this is where some young girls, they mature quicker than boys do in the pre-adolescence. They begin their adolescence or their that period of time. It starts earlier for them. And that's where a lot of the awkwardness comes from. Because boys are still goofy little boys that don't understand all that stuff, and they laugh and they giggle and they want to make jokes. And then all of a sudden they become teenagers and they see girls differently. When they're preteens, girls are a nuisance. They don't know how to do things right. They should be playing with frogs and snakes and jumping creeks. Then they become teenage boys and they're chasing the girls.
With frogs and snakes.
With well, that's the beginning. You're right on that one, Lee. Okay, and then the second period is middle adolescence. And that's the period from ages 14 to 18 when the young person is in high school. And then the next period is what's called post-adolescence. And that includes the late teenage years and extends into the early 20s. And this is what I was referring to earlier. Not everybody matures at the same rate. So just because you turn 18 or 19 years old doesn't mean that now you're an adult and you got it all together. You may still be going through some of these changes in your life into your early 20s. So in the pre-adolescent stage, there are biological changes that can evoke simultaneous feelings of anxiety, bewilderment, and delight. It's a weird time. I can remember a little bit about when I was 10, 11 years old. It was getting weird. Life was funny, it just sometimes made me sad and made me angry. Couldn't figure it out. But it's because my mind and my body were all getting ready for this big change. It would be a chemical change that's going to begin to happen as well. It's not just my body's growing, but there are things that are happening inside of my body. This never happened before. Okay, now I'm going to move through these next ones. All right, if you've got a textbook, open up to table 14-1, please. If you don't, if you want to huddle around somebody that does, Lee, if you want to sit in the middle of those guys in the back there, maybe. One big happy family. You're all worn out from all of the stuff you did today. So everybody in Zoom, if you could just start working on getting that. Table 14-1. Okay, so I just want to work through this a little bit. This talks about teenage personalities. And some of you have done the personality profiling, the basic studies of personality profiling. This is a little bit different perspective. This is focusing primarily on teenage personalities, and it is according to the Barna Research Group. Teenagers can be divided into 4 overlapping personality niches. First one, they're called interactives. Excuse me. That includes almost half the teenage population. They're highly personable, focused on relationships, and sensitive to others. So they live with a relaxed approach to problem solving and tend to be hospitable and minimally influenced by stress. They're just cool as a cucumber. They love to interact. They'll jump right in, get in the conversation with you. Now, they may not always make sense, but they will interact. Okay? Then there are those that are called the dynamos. That represents about 1/4 of the teen world. So your first group is about 50%. This group is about 25%. They are aggressive, focused, driven, above average in productivity, and effective problem solvers. Now, I like this part. They also can irritate others with their high energy, competitiveness, and self-assurance. Can I get a witness to that one? And you say, amen. So those are the dynamos. Thank God they're only 25%. Then you have the stabilizers. So the stabilizers describe about 1/5 of adolescence. They're marked by consistency, loyalty, thoroughness, and predictability, but they also can be rigid and lacking in creativity. So that means they're not flexible. This is the way it's supposed to be. This is the way it's going to be. And if I don't get my way, I'm going to stomp my feet. I'm going to kick the doors. I'm going to just have a tantrum. But they're consistent. All right? And then you have the evaluators. The evaluators are the smallest group. They like details and insist on accuracy and completeness. They tend to be perfectionists who put high demands on themselves and others. Now, that's a chart that I would recommend that maybe you print out if you have the electronic. If not, I can print it out for you, actually. I just thought of that. I'm telling you guys, you could print it out. I could print it out. Just like that. Boom, boom. Let me print some. Selection. And let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We'll do 7 copies in here. Anybody else, if you come in and you want a copy of it, let me know. We'll get you one. I just sent it to the printer, so we'll get it when we have a break. Yeah, it should be on the small printer. All right, so during this period of life, this period of adolescence, there are at least 4 important questions that need to be answered. 4 important questions. And the first one is the question of identity. Who am I? Not unusual, is it? Growing up, you watch kids, and what do? They mimic their heroes. Now, for us, well, for me, growing up, in particular, we were baseball fanatics. And we mimicked a lot of baseball players. We would find our favorite player on our favorite team, watch the way that they would throw the ball, watch the way that they would swing the bat, and we tried to do the same things. We wanted to be like them. You know, growing up, I wanted to be Carl Yastrzemski, the man they call Yaz. And, you know, I couldn't mimic him too much. First of all, he was a left-handed batter, and his stance was too awkward for me. I wasn't physically able to do that, but it's like that's what I wanted to be because I didn't know who I was. And so that's what happens with a lot of kids. They don't really know who they are, so they're watching you as parents, or they're watching other adults, and they're saying, who am I? You know, who are you? And should I be like you? So kids mimic a lot of things that they see. So they deal with this thing, who am I? And then the second question is the question of relationships. How do I get along with others? What am I supposed to do? How do I get along? So you're moving into that area now where it's not just your guy friends in school, in 5th grade and 6th grade. Now you're beginning to deal with the girls. What is my relationship supposed to be like with girls? The third question is the question of the future. Where will I fit? Where am I going to fit in? And so in order to be able to answer that question, they have to know what their values are. You have to identify their personalities. So while you can look at the chart that I just printed out for those of you here in the classroom, you can try to find which one they are and help them to identify with that, and that will tell them where they're going to fit. Because there are just certain personalities that don't fit in certain jobs. Parents can't force their kids to do something because they say this is the best future for you because it'll make you the most money. But if they're not fitted for it, it's going to make them the most frustration. So, what are their personality traits? What are their capabilities? Then you have to look at the socioeconomic level that they're in. So, for us growing up in our adolescent years, it wasn't a question of which college are we going to. It's what are we going to do when we get out of high school, because we can't afford to go to college. They didn't have scholarships like they do now. It was just impossible. Most families couldn't afford it. They're raising 5 kids, 6 kids, dozen kids, whatever it is. And, one says, well, I really want to go to college. I want to be a CPA. Well, you're going to have to go on your own. You're going to have to borrow the money. Then you can't borrow the money because you don't have a job, and you can't get a job because you don't have the experience. So the socioeconomic level that you're in affects what you're going to do with your future. So the choice was somewhat simple for most of us. It's like get a trade or go in the military. And that's what you had to choose. You're going to get a trade. Now getting a trade is smarter than anything else because that's where the real money is at, right? And people are enjoying it once again. Where will I fit? Then there's the question of ideology. What do I believe? Now, are you shocked when you find out teenagers are no longer carrying the same beliefs that their parents had when they were raising them?
Shock,
No. We used to think that they're automatically going to do it, but do they? No, they don't. Nope. Because what are they doing? They're questioning all of these things. They believe what they believe because that's what they were told to do. So parents really need to take a different approach to raising their kids in faith. You don't tell kids, well, this is what we believe, and never sit down and have a dialogue about it and say, well, we believe this, and this is why we believe this. And these are the alternatives, but these are the consequences to the alternatives. This is what we believe. Here's our fundamental statement of faith. If you're going to be a child in my house, you're going to live by this. Well, that doesn't work, okay? So what happens is these kids start to question their ideologies. What you might consider an ideal, they don't anymore because of peer pressure. They're getting influence from other kids in schools that are not raised in the same values that you have. So it's more than just religion. What are my values going to be? Where am I going to land on all of these things? So that's the question of ideology that adolescents are going to have to answer. So that's why it's important in the preteen years that we always try to give an answer of why, not just tell them what. This is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. All right? Now, there's a term that is used by the writer here, and it's called mosaics. How many of you have ever heard of mosaics until now? Yeah, there was I can't remember if it was back in the 1980s, maybe early 80s, middle 80s, where a group of pastors began what was called the Mosaic movement. And it was very interesting, the things that were going on. So I highlighted this for you. The Mosaics are non-linear in their thinking style and comfortable with contradictions in their spirituality, values, politics, and morality. Okay, non-linear in their thinking style means they're not straight thinking. It's not A to B to C to D. There is no order to the way that they think about things. There is no necessary order to the way that they're going to do things. So that group, the Mosaics, are non-linear in their thinking style. And it doesn't bother them if they have contradictions in their spirituality. So they may believe in something, but yet it contradicts the values of culture around them, but it doesn't bother them. It's like, no big deal. Get over it. And that is a thought process that has permeated, especially America. It's like everybody's random in their thinking, and they don't care what other people might think. This is what I believe, and this is what I'm going to do. Okay? So as the writer says, they're less constrained by relationships, traditional sexual standards, religious and spiritual beliefs, or lifestyle choices. They're not bound by that. They see nothing wrong with cohabiting with a person of the opposite sex. They don't see anything wrong with experimenting, sexually experimenting. There's nothing wrong with that, they say. So those are the Mosaics, and they're the ones that are basically going to challenge what they call tradition. But there's a difference between human traditions and righteous standards. But they're going to challenge it. And those are the Mosaics. And it's important for you to understand that as we move on, okay? Because now what I want to do is I want to cover a little bit on the Bible and adolescence. The concept of adolescence as we know it did not appear in the literature on child rearing until late in the 19th century, which is late 1800s. The word adolescent doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible. And it may be that biblical writers didn't even think of adolescence as a separate period of development. So in the scriptures, children and youth are mentioned frequently, aren't they? But never anything about adolescence. So at what point, like we talked about a few minutes ago, at what point do they become young adults? That was based upon maturity. Now, here's another thing about that. When are they viewed as adults? Culture determines a lot of that. All right? So part of the question that Karen asked me this morning was, are Jewish boys considered adults when they bar mitzvah? And that is a good question. They are considered to be more mature, but they're not considered to be adults yet. As a matter of fact, in ancient Jewish culture, the males really didn't do anything until they were near their 30s. So that young adult period of time, they never were actively engaged in leadership and different things. Now, there were exceptions to that. Exceptions in the Old Testament. Was it Josiah that was, 8 years old when he became king? Because his father had died. He was next in line. But his mother actually ran the nation. He was a token king, but he was nowhere near ready to handle all of that stuff. So, again, adulthood is basically determined by your culture. And, the proximity of where you live, what people determine. So here we have a number thrown at us, and that's 18 years old. So once a person's 18 years old, You can vote, you can do this, you can do that, you can join the military. So it's assumed that you're ready to handle life. But now, when you look at people in their early 20s, they're very immature compared to people that were in their 20s in the 50s and 60s. I grew up in a time when people that were in their early 20s were already raising 2 or 3 kids. They were raising a family at that point, and they were handling it. They were taught work ethics. They were taught how to manage things. So what went wrong? This isn't in the textbook, but now I'm going to preach. What went wrong? We had a generation of parents that began to spoil their children. What I went through, I don't want them to go through. I'm going to protect them from the hardships that I went through. I'm not going to discipline them the way that my parents disciplined me because I didn't like it. Those decisions are made, and these children are raised without certain disciplines, and they're sheltered by their parents. And people say, well, we're not sheltering our kids. Well, yeah, you are, if you don't let them suffer the consequences of their decisions. If you're always bailing them out, if you're always covering for them because you don't want them to be hurt, then what are you doing? You're telling them that they're entitled and they don't have to be mature, and that doesn't matter what goes wrong, you're going to fix it. That is totally different than trusting God for provision. That's not the same thing. God is not in heaven saying to us, go ahead, do whatever you want to do. Any mistake that you make, I'll take care of it. I'll cover for you. I'll bail you out. I'll do that. Yeah, that's not what God does. And then people quote, well, all things work together for good to those that love the Lord, to those that are called according to his purpose. Well, your actions tell me you don't love the Lord. Okay? So God is not there saying, I'm going to cover it up. And so we've done that with children to the point that now they're raising their kids, or they have raised their kids in the same manner. And so now it's all entitlement. I don't have to work. I can get a free check. The more kids I get, the more money I get. That's the way that I get ahead. That's my plan for prosperity. And that's all nonsense. But this is what has happened, is we have coddled and we have sheltered people to a point where, don't worry about it. Do what you want. There are some that are coming around. Thank God that there's an awakening that's taking place, and some of our parents and some of the new generation that is coming into the world now, they're saying, I'm not making those mistakes. I'm going to teach my children responsibility. So, I had my first paying job when I was 13. After school, I got on the school bus because I usually walked home, but I got on the school bus because the bus driver was a farmer. I got on the bus, I went home with him. And when we got there, I milked cows. Through the winter, I milked cows. Spring came, I spread manure. Summer came, I worked the fields. I worked machinery, 13 years old, 14 years old, and I got paid. Okay, you wouldn't work for what I got paid then, but 13. And people say, well, that's child abuse. No, that taught me a work ethic. And I raised my kids to work. I taught them the value of work, and they're hard workers. Okay, so anyway, that's my sermon for the night.
Thank you.
Okay, so when do they become adults? When they become responsible. And they can prove that they have responsibility. They understand. And they know the value of family. They know the value of money. They know the value of having a job. Those things are important. So the Bible, while it doesn't mention adolescence, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just a title that's been put on it. It's a period of time where people are growing and learning to be responsible. Think about Mary in the Bible. She was engaged and she was a teenage girl. You know, nowadays you look at some of the teenage girls and you think, I can't imagine them even getting married. There's no way in the world that they could do that. They're so immature. But girls in that time, they had responsibilities and they grew up. Okay? So, I know we're eating up time here tonight. We're going kind of rapidly here. The time is anyway. Let's take some time, and I want to talk about the causes of adolescent problems. The causes of adolescent problems. And let me just take a moment to check to see. We got two. Yeah, Karen in here was saying it used to be that students went to 8th grade in elementary school. Now they leave after 5th grade. Yeah, that's a big cultural shift that took place, but that's what I went through. 8 grades in the elementary building. 8 grades, 4 rooms, 4 teachers. 1 teacher did 2 grades. That's what we had, but anyway. And yeah, it used to be 21 to vote when she was in Pennsylvania. There was a time when I was younger, I remember, I think it was 21, that you had to be 21 in order to vote. States were different, but all right. So, what are the causes of adolescent problems? So, adolescent society changes quickly. Now, notice the term adolescent society, not society in general. They have their own little society. They have their own little culture. And they're no longer on Facebook. Only a few of them are. Why? Because some of the older people moved in. And they wanted to move out. Because they have their own society. And, you know, if you're 30-something years old, you're too old. You need to get out of here. Okay? So it changes quickly, and it's easy for adults to be out of touch with contemporary teenagers. You can't lose touch with them. Now, that does not mean that we should be like them in order to understand them. It just simply means communicate. Talk to your kids. And this is what causes some of the problems with teenagers is the lack of communication with their parents. And it's not a language barrier. It's just an unwillingness to hear. So, you know, and then there's some people that immediately criticize, and that puts a barrier up, creates a problem for a teenager. I can't discuss this with my parents. Okay? Now, there are several issues that persist and create problems for adolescents. Doesn't matter where you are in the world. And we're going to look at those right now. And first one is physical changes. So adolescents can be influenced psychologically by uneven physical growth. Those are the awkward stages. Skin problems, excess fat, or extra skinny. The periodic decreases in energy. Did you ever notice that? People say, well, teenagers are lazy. No. Did you know that teenagers require more sleep than preteens? See, a lot of people don't know that because physiologically, that body is in a major growth. You know, your limbs are growing out, you're in that awkward stage, and because of all of the changes that are taking place in the body of a teenager, it requires more rest. You get tired quicker. So really, there was some research that was done on this, and of course, nobody's ever going to do anything about this. But it was at one point, and this was just 5 or 6 years ago, it was recommended that elementary students start school at the time that high school students do. And high school students would start school at the time that the elementary does. But it's the other way around because of more sleep being required. Instead, they get you up at 6 o'clock in the morning. In my case, get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to get ready to go to school, to get on the bus, to drive for 30 minutes on the bus because I was in a rural area. And then I would arrive at school and started before 7:30. It was an early start, and you're tired. And then after school, you have a part-time job, you're in athletics, all of those things. You wear down. And that's what happens. You're going through all of these physical changes. So, again, it comes down to the psychology of it all as well, because your body is changing in different proportions. And especially for girls, they're noticing things that are changing, right? Body hair, suddenly, in my case, it didn't happen until I was in my 20s, but, you know, the facial hair on the boys and maybe growing on the chest. Those are things that are somewhat awkward, and, you know, girls will giggle and tee-hee at it and all that fun stuff. And it's a psychological thing that's going on. It's like, I don't like that. It's embarrassing, right? The voices change. Most kids, they have a high-pitched voice, the boys. Then all of a sudden, they come into adolescence. They're just knocking on the door of puberty. Now their voice is beginning to change. It's getting a little bit deeper. And girls' voices are changing. They're getting a little bit higher or mellowing out just a little bit, right? So all of that stuff is now changing. We had a friend in high school that was a difficult period for him. He had a high, squeaky voice. He could be talking along and suddenly it would go into a very high pitch, not because he did it. It would just happen. And people used to laugh at it, but it affected him psychologically. It's like he couldn't help it. But that's what took place. And then later on, he never did it again. He developed his male voice. So those are changes that take place. And then, of course, there are the sexual changes. And those are things that, as a counselor, you have to be aware of. Is that teenager is going through sexual changes. And there are a lot of questions that they're going to have. Suddenly, they're having impulses that they never had before. Now their thoughts are different, and it's like, why am I thinking that way? I've never thought that way before. Why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? Why do I have this urge to be with this person, right? All of those things are beginning to happen, and they're not understanding it, because it wasn't like that when they were catching frogs and snakes and having a good time. So they're beginning to experience that. And then their whole perspective on sexuality begins to change. This is where they're going to begin to develop their value system, their sexual value system. And there is such a thing. Okay? So, see, in the book it says that one study of American adolescents found, for example, that sex outside of marriage was considered morally acceptable by 54% of the Mosaic generation, as opposed to 40% of their baby boomer parents. You see the shift in the thinking that's taking place. So you take the Mosaics with their sexual values or lack of them, and now they're influencing peers. When you got teenagers that are trying to find their sexual identity, trying to understand these changes that are taking place, now they're being influenced by their friends and saying, oh, that's okay. You can do this and you can do that. And that is not the value that most parents hold. Okay? So then the 60s is where it really began. They called it the sexual revolution. It was the sexual explosion, because the whole view of sexuality changed in the 1960s. And what used to be taboo was normal. And it was actually applauded. And to the point now where it's even more so. And if you don't accept it, then you're canceled. That's it. You're done. You're canceled. All right. Another cause of adolescent problems is interpersonal changes. This deals with parents and peers, your relationship with them. Things are changing. So let me express this. It is natural for the relationship between the teenager and the parent to begin to change during that adolescent period, because that person is beginning to take on more independence, and you are training them and you're letting them loose. You're giving them freedoms that they didn't have before with boundaries so that they can learn how to begin to make decisions on their own, not major decisions. You know, you don't want your 13-year-old trying to decide who they're going to marry. That's not quite what we want to be happening, right? So a lot of the decisions that are being made, okay, what friends do you have? Parents should still be involved in the friends that their teenagers have, but they also should not be micromanaging them. Teach them the values that are necessary, but let them begin to have their friends and to do things. Another thing in adolescence is in interpersonal is trust. Trust has to be earned. And as trust is earned, a little more trust can be given. When trust is betrayed, then you have to draw it back, because now, if you're not careful, they're going to cross the border and their interpersonal relationships are going to be tainted. Right? You all following what I'm saying? So even though they might feel confused, anxious, and angry, you know, if there's conflict in the home, instability at school, or it could be that nothing in the world seems to be stable to them, that's when they're having interpersonal problems. Be sensitive. Be listening. The fourth thing, changing values, morals, and religious beliefs. We've already talked about that a little bit, right? So prior to adolescence, a young person may accept parental standards with little question or challenge. As they get older, however, adolescents begin to question parental viewpoints, and peers have a greater impact on the molding of core beliefs and values. We have to, as adults, understand that our kids are going to be influenced more by their peers in high school than they are us at home, even though we've brought them to church. That's another reason why public schools are detrimental to people's health. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about that tonight. So there are changing values, morals, and religious beliefs. You know, as counselors, we have to be attuned to that. We have to understand if this is what's going on in a child, we're not going to berate them for that, or a teenager, we're not going to say, well, you know better than that. You need to listen to your parents. That's not how we handle that. That doesn't mean that we disagree with the parents, but what we say is we're going to find out what's going on. Let's get to the bottom of this. And I'm going to try to help you to understand that your parents' value system is better than what you think. All right, let's see. Number 5 is the move to independence. I already talked about that a little bit. They're always moving toward that, incrementally moving toward their independence. Not everybody is going to mature the same, so not every child is going to have the same independence at the same age. So growing up, I grew up in a family of 6 kids. And being in a rural area, we were hunters. That was a common thing for everybody in Vermont. You were a hunter. Fall came, you wore orange and heavy boots, and you went out hunting. But in my house, my parents would not allow us to go hunting until we were 12 years old. Now, that may seem young, but we had to be 12 years old. So I had already taken the NRA courses. I learned rifle safety, all of that stuff. And it was time for me to get my license, and I did. And I'm going on my first hunting excursion at 12 years old. And I remember a couple of my brothers saying, it's not fair. We have to wait, and he can go hunting now. Well, I was the oldest. I was 12. They had to wait until they were 12. So they wanted the same independence that I had, but they were not ready for it. And then none of my brothers were this way, but there are some families where their kids, it's like, no, you're not getting a license at 12. No, you need to wait a little while. You're a little too hot-headed there, whatever, okay? All right, let's move on. Number 6 is acquiring skills and building self-esteem. Have you ever heard teenagers complain about how they look? I'm not smart. Some of them are athletic and some of them are awkward. Some of them can run real fast and other ones stumble every time they try to run. These are all things that are going on. But the worst part of it is the self-criticism. Okay, so these are all things, they're at a point where they're having trouble because they can't acquire the right skills, they're not building proper self-esteem. Now, the thought of self-esteem may contradict what we believe as Christians because it is Christ that we're supposed to be emulating. So we have to model ourselves. Our self-esteem needs to be built according to who He is and who He says we are in Him. And a lot of them are building their self-esteem based upon their friends. Okay? Sometimes some adolescents lack social skills. And they're not invited to parties or, they're laughed at. They're the brunt of jokes. Okay, and then the seventh one are the concerns about the future. So late adolescence has been called a period when young people are free to regroup psychologically and socially while they seek to find their niches in society. That's when things really change. Now, I don't know about you. I'd like to hear from you about this, but when I left high school, I went into the military, and almost every person that I had connection with, interpersonal relationships and so forth, almost every one of them went their way. We never ran the same path again. So all of the stuff that I went through in my adolescent years and in high school, all of the experiences I had, the negative and the positive, those people were no longer in my life. But when you're there, it feels like it's going to be your whole life, doesn't it? It's going to be forever. And so when you begin to get concerned about the future, you have to make future plans not based upon your friends, but based upon what's best for you and what God wants for you. And so in counseling adolescents, we have to let them know that while you think that that's the most important thing in the world right now, there's probably a 90% probability that you'll never walk the same path with those people again once you guys leave high school. You'll go into a different career field. You'll start working with different people. You'll have new peers that you're going to be working with. It's not going to be the same. They're not your life. Don't conform to them. Any questions on any of this?
I got one.
Okay.
It goes back to the age of being considered an adult. Biblically speaking, is there isn't a certain age for the age of accountability. That comes.
That's important.
Right. So
Yeah.
that comes with the maturity level that the person's at.
Yeah. And the age of accountability has to do with your understanding.
Okay.
The age of accountability when it comes to personal salvation is when you know right from wrong.
Right.
And you understand, what Jesus did.
Yeah, going back, actually adding to what he was saying, when I would read the scriptures a lot, I'd always hear this term where, well, Jesus would say it too, but it would always be this term where it's he's of age or she's of age.
Yeah.
And scripture wouldn't really give, and I would always look for specifics on what age gap that'll range from, but unfortunately, I couldn't really find it.
Well, most of those, when that's mentioned in there, they were in their 40s.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what they would fall back on. Well, they're of age, ask them. I'm not responsible for them anymore. Yeah, the one that got healed from the blindness.
Yeah.
It's like, ask him, he's of age. Because they feared the Pharisees.
Yeah.
And they knew what was going to happen. But, yeah. But that is true. That's a good thing. You know, good point you bring up. He is of age. So there is a point when they were responsible for their own actions, responsible for their own choices.
Yeah, but for a blind man that was just healed, and for their fear of being cast out of the synagogue.
Yep.
It's like you would think he'd be of age earlier than 40, right? Whatever the definition of age is.
But if he was like so disabled, I mean, I really wonder, you know, since his parents probably had to help him with almost everything because he was blind.
Yeah.
What would have
Oh yeah, he was
looked like?
dependent. Yeah, he was dependent. Now all of a sudden he's of age. Ask him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now he can see. He can take care of himself.
All
right. I want to just highlight a couple of things here, and counseling. We're going to talk. I want to talk just a few minutes about counseling. So, you know, we've talked about this a lot. Some of the same principles apply to counseling teens as it does counseling children. Most of the time, the parents are going to be involved to a certain point when you're counseling teens. But you also have to counsel the parents. There are certain things that you have to do when you're doing that. And I've highlighted a few things, and I'm going to read them to you real quick as we go through here. So, these are some guidelines. First of all, you want to support and encourage them. So you want to provide support and encouragement. So whether the parents conclude that they're to blame or not doesn't mean that they're bad parents. It may be that is something that the parents did. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but not necessarily is it the parents' fault. But you're not looking for a place to put blame when you're counseling. You're trying to find the cause of the problem. You know, where is the rift and what can I do to help that? The primary aim is to bring healing to the family. Okay? So when you're counseling the adults, then you want to provide support and encouragement. Then you also want to provide family counseling. That's when you would have the teenager and the parents. Sometimes, and I've done this, I have the whole family. Mom and dad and all of the children. We have a powwow and we talk. And then I ask questions, you know, and I've done it long enough, and one of the things that you will learn is when to divide them. At what point do you excuse the parents and then begin to work with the teen? And vice versa. When do you say to the teen, I need to spend some time with your parents? You got to be able to know that. You got to be able to discern where to draw the line. Because sometimes you get into a place where things are heated and you can tell that there's not going to be any reconciliation, that this is just going to be an argument that never comes to an end, and this is what's happening in the home, so it's not going to happen in my office. We're going to stop this. We're going to find out what's going on. I'm going to get to the root of it, and I'm going to try to resolve it through individual counseling now. Time with the parents and times with the teenager or teenagers, whatever the case may be. So you have to provide family counseling. Another thing, you got to set limits. Sometimes there are teenagers that want more freedom than what they should have. And, you know, mom and dad have set boundaries and the teenager is rebelling against the boundaries. It's not our job as counselors to help mom and dad to see the error of their way and let this child breach those boundaries. That's not what we do. Our job is to work with the teenager to understand why there are boundaries there. And they're not going to like it. So you have to learn how to be loving and patient and listen and help them to understand. Okay? But limits have to be set. Then there is spiritual guidance. So especially when teenagers are beginning to forsake their walk with the Lord, their spiritual upbringing, if they start to do that. Not all of them do. Some of them do. But this is where counselors have to provide spiritual guidance. All right. Now, what about counseling adolescents? I'm going to say this, and this is just personal advice, that if teenagers bother you, then I would not recommend counseling teenagers. If you think that they're all spoiled and entitled and they all need to be punished, find another job. So, one of the most difficult things in counseling adolescents is to establish a trusting relationship. So you have to build trust with that teenager when they're coming in to see you for counseling. And it's not trust because you're taking their side. You need to let them know and feel that you're not there to judge them. You're there to listen to them. And you're going to give them a fair shake. And you're not going to take the parent's side. I've seen counselors do that. And they're rough with the kids and they get nowhere. But they sure made their point. All right, you made your point, but you lost the soul. Because, it's not about being right or wrong. It's about being godly. Think about that when you say, well, godly is right. Yeah, being godly is right. But not when it comes to an argument, people think, well, I'm right and you're wrong. That's all there is to it. Let me help to understand. I want you to explain to me why you feel the way that you do. Why do you think you deserve that? What have you done to think that you earned that? Let's find out what's going on. Then you want to build a rapport. So honesty and respect mixed with compassion and gentle firmness are all important, especially as counseling begins. Honesty, respect, compassion, and firmness, gentle firmness. And they give you some examples in the textbook here of what you could do, but it's just, start the conversation. So, can you tell me what brought you here? Not, well, what are you doing here? No. Can you tell me what brought you here? Well, my parents, they made me come. Okay. Why? Why do you think they made you come here? Because they don't understand me. Okay, what is it they don't understand? What's going on? What is it your parents don't understand about you? Can you explain it to me? Well, you won't understand. Try me. Try me. Just go ahead. Try me. I'm going to try to understand you. So what is going on here? Now, here's a technique that I recommend that you use, is that when you're trying to open up dialogue, especially with an adolescent, if you've asked him a question, wait. 30 seconds is a short amount of time if you're underwater and you want to breathe, right? You're going to get out of there quick. Well, it's not a short amount of time. It's a long amount of time. But anyway, if you're down and you're playing a game and seconds count, you got 30 seconds left on the clock, you feel the pressure. So you got to do something, right? When you're in a counseling situation and you've asked a question, wait. Even if it's silent, 30 seconds will feel like a long time. But you know what happens in the awkwardness of the silence? They begin to talk. They'll say something, and that'll get them going. Never talk over them, unless they're getting rude, of course, but don't talk over them. Listen to them. Give them feedback onto what they're saying to you. So you're saying this, okay? So you're saying that your mom and dad don't understand you and that you want to stay out until 11 o'clock at night. You do know you're only 11 years old, but anyway. That was just a joke. But so it's like you're repeating back to them what they're saying. You're not correcting them, but you're saying, so I want to understand you. So this is what you're saying. This is what your issue is. So you're listening to me. Yeah, I'm listening to you. And it's not going to happen in one session. It takes time. And that's where you're building a rapport. Okay? And then you have to, of course, set limits with them. Set limits with the parents, set limits with the kids. And I'll read to you what it says in the textbook. Counseling with teens often involves a power struggle in which the teenager can be manipulative, coercing, and dominating. Two experienced counselors have suggested that power struggles are reduced when counselors avoid 4 common mistakes of counseling teenagers. I like these 4 common mistakes. Not that I want to do them. I like what they're sharing here. Mistake number 1, courting the teenage counselee. I found that an interesting term, courting the teenage counselee. What is that? It's when the counselor tries to persuade the teenager or make promises that lure the teenager into the counseling room. Then the young person is given power to control or negotiate. You don't want to come in? Okay. I'm not going to give you anything. I'm not going to promise anything. If you come in, I'll make sure you're comfortable. I'll make sure that. So now they're in control. So I'll come in if. It's conditional. That's not what you're doing. You want them to come in because you want to help them. Okay? So never give them the power over you. Mistake number 2 is telling parents to back off. While it may seem a tempting thing when you're counseling a youth to say to the parents, you need to back off. You're pushing too hard. Unless you know that they are definitely pushing too hard the wrong way, then you can say that, but you're never going to do that in front of the counselee. No, you never correct the parents. You never tell them to back off. You want them to be involved. So demands for privacy can be ways for troubled teens to conceal their self-destructive and sometimes illegal behavior. Parents need to know they have a legal right. That flies in the face of the systems that we have now, doesn't it? The parents have a legal right to know what is going on. Yet the court systems are not supporting it much anymore, and that is a part of the destruction of the family unit. That is the plan of Satan. That is the plan of socialism, is to destroy the very fabric of the family. Control the minds of the youth. So you never tell a child, I'll never tell your parents what you said. I'll never do it. Confidentiality can be expected to a certain point, but you got some legal issues that you got to consider. So mistake number 3, putting no limits on family criticism. Now, when you're counseling, there is going to be criticism that's going to come from your counselees because they're hurt or confused or whatever is going on. So there is going to be some criticism. So now what you need to do is make it constructive. But there is a point when criticism becomes destructive. It's like no matter what I say, everything you say is negative. You have nothing positive to say. We need to stop right there. That's got to stop. That's a problem. That's creating a problem in your thinking. Okay? So that's something that we have to watch out for. That's a mistake. It's one thing to express yourself, but it's another to go over the top. Mistake number 4 is giving in to tunnel vision. So don't get so focused on what you hear from parents or teens that you miss the bigger picture. When I was running Christian schools, when I would do parent orientation night, parent-student orientation, there was one thing that I said to the parents. I said, I want to make a deal with you. We won't believe half of what your kids say about you if you don't believe half of what they say about us. because they can get tunnel vision, and all they can see is a problem, and they go home and they complain. Your counselees may have tunnel vision. The parents may have tunnel vision. Don't get caught in that tunnel. You need to stay with a broad perspective. You want the big picture. What is really going on here? All right? I can see the tree in front of me, but I can't see the forest that the tree is in. I need to back up and get a better perspective of it. So always, always look for the big picture. Yes.
When you say tunnel vision, you mean like, the way I explain it is like kind of taking what they say and adopting it as like absolute and not like looking anywhere else.
Yeah, that's good.
Is
yeah.
that what you?
That's
okay.
right. Yeah.
So
So
sometimes I make that mistake. Sometimes with meeting even new people, you know, like sometimes they say they're this and okay, this guy's this, and then you kind of find out they're a whole different person. Like,
Yes.
because you lock yourself in
Yeah.
that way of thinking. So
yeah, and that's tunnel vision.
okay, yeah.
So I've seen that too with adolescents, where, you know, a girl may be falling for a teenage boy, and see, I did foster care, so I had different teenage girls, and I'm like, you don't know him, but they had such tunnel vision that they wouldn't hear anything negative. So 2 of my foster girls ended up getting pregnant from that one boy eventually later on, and he was a criminal, and I think he's probably serving life, but they couldn't see that because he was a charmer. But I could see that. I could see through him. And unfortunately, even the system thought he was a poster boy. He was presented to us at a banquet of a great example of what this system can do in transforming young lives. And I'm like, you idiots. You don't know what this kid is. And he was. Guns and drugs and whatever. Poor kids. Sadly, some of his kids come here. Well, not sadly that they come here, but that's their daddy. You know, it's a sad thing when you see that, but that's tunnel vision. You can't see past that. It's like, I'm not going to listen to you. And a lot of teenagers will do that. They won't listen. It's like, you don't know what you're talking about. That's one of the favorite lines. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand like I do. I don't? Okay. All right. And then another issue is transference. So you have to recognize that you are often going to be treated with hostility, suspicion, fear, or praise primarily because you resemble some other adult. You remind me of so-and-so. Well, I'm not so-and-so. But if they do, there's going to be transference. All right. Now, I want you all to study the section on preventing the problems of adolescence. That's going to come up probably in your final. If some of you that are writing your essays at the end, I would like you to focus on that just a little bit, of preventing the problems. Some of the ways that you can prevent problems. So very quickly, I'll give you a quick list. Build a spiritual foundation. Work to develop family examples and stability. Use education. Stimulate interpersonal support. And give guidance. Those are some things that you can work on. So as a counselor, those are key things for you to do. And again, as we have done the last few terms, some of the questions for your final exam are going to come out of the key points for busy counselors. Okay? So does anyone have any questions or comments you want to make? No? Everybody's good? I was just checking here. Let me check here. Okay. Very good. Did you get anything out of this tonight?
Yes.
All right. So, I forgot to open this up here. Give me 1 second. Next week, we are going to be talking about young adults, I believe, right? Adolescents. What is it?
20s and 30s.
20s and 30s, chapter 15. Okay. So that's what we're going to be looking at next week. And as I always do, I try to go through each of the sections and highlight some important things that are in there. So we're going to be talking about the 20s and the 30s, and you guys are going to be in good company. All right? Well, thank you for your participation, everyone. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you so much for what we have discussed tonight, and I pray that you help us to grow as counselors. Help us to have an understanding of people and where they're at. And, you know, God, even for those students that are in this program that may not become counselors, they could be coaches, Lord, or they could be teachers, Bible study teachers, or youth leaders, whatever it is. I pray that you help each and every one to be able to get a better understanding of youth and how that we can help them to make better choices in their life and to live the life that you've called them for and have ordained for them. So bless this time, Lord. Bless this school, we pray, in the name of the Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. God bless you and watch over you. We'll see you next time.